Good afternoon, boys and girls. Welcome back to part 2 of our Fairies and Elves series. This story is called Lands Behind Enchantments Veil. Part 2. On the first day of May one year, the sky to the north of the island was darkened by a cloud that spread across the rolling hills and blotted out the sun. It gathered around the peaks of the mountain of Clonmacnois Rain, in the very heart of Ireland, and hung in the air for 3 days. When the mist thinned and drifted out to sea, troops of glittering warriors wound in columns down the mountain, drove away the people of the Firbolg, and took the island for themselves. The fairy warriors had come from enchanted islands at the top of the world, traveling to this green and pleasant land in the dark cloud that had settled around Clonmacnois Rain. They were called by humans Tuatha De Danann, which meant the people of the goddess Danu, a fertility goddess. The title may have come to them because of their elfin power over the growth of crops. They were famed in the words of an early scribe as, quote, the most handsome and delightful company, the fairest of form, the most distinguished in their equipment and apparel, and their skill in music and playing, the most gifted in mind and temperament that ever came to Ireland, end quote. Their power was great, for they possessed magic talismans, a spear and sword no enemy could survive, and a cauldron that was never empty of food. How long the Tuatha reigned, nobody knows, but sometime in an antiquity older than the granite of the Irish mountains, they were conquered, despite their talismans, by new and mortal invaders, ancestors of the Gauls, who were to rule the island. The Tuatha took refuge in invisibility. Some built kingdoms within the hollow hills or beneath the lakes of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and some made their homes on islands far across the western seas. They hid their kingdom with walls that were invisible except to themselves and impenetrable to most mortals. That was the beginning of the retreat of the Tuatha and the time when they gained the name Deoin Side. But their final disappearance would not come for hundreds and hundreds of years. Meanwhile, these heroic beings pursued their wars and loves, generally unseen by the humans who had conquered them. During those centuries, fairy and mortal, though separated, were bound in a network of needs and desires, linked by the world of stream and sea, of leaf and tree and field. The two races reached out to each other in defiance of their alien natures. Again and again, in the comradeship of arms or in the bright fires of love, the beings of fairy ventured into the mortal world. Again and again, mortals set out on journeys that carried them unknowing across the boundaries of fairy, and their adventures were curious indeed. For the sea-girt Irish, each ocean voyage was uncertain. The waters of the Irish Sea and the North Atlantic were speckled with strange and shifting islands. As the Irish Imrama voyage tales record, adventurers told of sighting such islands as one of cat-headed men, and another of men with dogs' heads, one with a fountain that yielded milk, ale, and wine, one of giant horses, and one that turned anything cast on one side white and anything cast on the other black. It was hard to tell in those days whether a sea voyage would go on in a normal, uneventful way, or whether the fierce wind and tides of the north would drive the little boats off course and across an invisible barrier into the realm of fairy, where adventures would begin, as they did for a prince named Teague. His story was this. Teague was the heir of an early lord of Munster in the west of Ireland, and he took to the sea on a voyage of rescue and revenge. A marauder named Cathman, with a fleet of 9 ships, had invaded Teague's lands, laid waste the fields, burned the villages, and departed for his own stronghold, an island off the coast of Spain, taking as captives Teague's wife, Liben, and 2 of his brothers. Teague was left with 40 warriors, 1 captive from Cathman's band, and a fierce determination to deliver his family. He caused a currach, a stout ship, to be built. It had strong masts and broad-bladed oars, and the frame was covered, the story says, with hard red leather made from the hides of 40 oxen. In a bitter morning in March, they launched the little ship in Kerry Head, sliding her over the pebbles of the shore and into the grip of cresting seas. With their oars flashing, the Irish drove forward into wind and icy rain. And it was not long before Teague and his 40 warriors and the captive enemy, whom they had taken along to guide them, were out of sight of the cliffs of Munster. They sailed for a month, seeing little on the limitless and rolling sea except the sleek brown heads of inquisitive seals and the flash of leaping fish. From time to time they heard the blowing of whales. Twice they put in at unnamed islands to rest and repovision. Then came a space of 6 weeks when they made no landfall at all and traveled in a cloud of mist that was broken only occasionally by streaks of pale and watery sunlight. The men grew hushed and drawn. The captive guide, chained in the bow, squinted anxiously ahead, but he had lost his bearings in the fog. At last he said hopelessly, "We are adrift, drifting with the tide, and I know not where it will take us." Immediately after he spoke, a howling wind arose in the distance and tore across the sea toward them like a falcon stooping on its prey. The sea swelled high above the masts and roaring mountains that smashed icy torrents across the bow. Gasping under the onslaught, the men pulled at their oars with cold, stiffened fingers. As Teague shouted encouragement, they brought the boat around into the wind and held her there safely throughout the day and the screaming night that followed. Morning came at last, and the gale died. The sun rose, scattering diamonds across the surface of the sea. The men raised the currach's sails and headed west, and the sun played on their backs as they rested. Soon they saw in the distance a coastline. They steered for it, and at length the currach slid quietly into an estuary of green water so clear that the voyagers could see the silvery sands at the bottom and watch the darting of the scarlet salmon that played there. The shore on either side was fringed with trees, and from their midst poured the carols of unknown birds. Teague and his men made for shore and together pulled the currach up to dry on the shingle. Then they entered the wood. The travelers knew at once that this was no ordinary place. In Munster, spring had just begun. The earth was bare and hard there, and the trees were black. Here, however, the trees were thick with leaves and heavy with fruit. Their branches swayed gently, although no wind stirred, and they seemed to listen as the intruders passed beneath them. All were trees sacred to the Irish from ancient times, so revered that anyone who cut them might forfeit his life. Some were venerable and mighty oaks, worshipped since time began, and sentient still. Oaks wailed when they were cut. Apple trees, fertile guardians of immortality, grew in abundance, laden with scarlet globes. And among them stood many hazel trees, heavy with the clusters of yellow nuts that in Ireland sometimes bestow all the world's wisdom on the mortal lucky enough to eat them. After the men had walked some little distance, the wood thinned and became sunny again and park-like. Then the travelers found themselves at the verge of the wood looking into the country that it guarded. They laughed and exclaimed at the sight that met their eyes. Stretching out to the rim of the sky was a wide, smooth plain, cloaked in the green and white of flowering clover. Breaking the expanse were three grassy hills, each guarded by a high-walled palace. The men set out for the nearest one. At its marble ramparts they met a blithe and shining lady. She seemed to expect the travelers and to trust them, for she called Teague by name and sent him with his men to the hill beyond, where the scene was repeated. The travelers came to the third of the hills, and as they had been instructed, passed through the mighty arched gate of the castle and entered the courtyard. At its center grew a wide, spreading apple tree, its branches white with blossoms and also laden with fruit. From among the white blossoms drifted a woman like a flower. Her hair resembled silvered petals. She regarded the mortals with a calm gaze and said Teague's name. Care fell from him at the sound of her voice, and he listened with a calm that matched her own as she told these things. She said that she was a daughter called Cleodna Fairhair of the Tuatha de Danann, and that the island was her own. She said that the fruit of her apple tree was of such power that mortals who ate it would never hunger and would always be drawn to her lands. And she warned them that when a day passed in her realm, though it seemed but a day, a year passed in the mortal world, so that Teague was reminded of the quest he had undertaken. Then the fairy told Teague that she would give 3 gifts to aid him on his quest. The first was a guide to the place of battle. The guide comprised 3 birds she summoned from the branches of the apple tree, 1 blue with a crimson head, 1 scarlet with a head of green, and 1 of many colors whose head shone gold. The second gift the fairy gave was an emerald chalice. It would guard Teague's life as long as he kept it by him, she said. And the last gift was this. She told Teague what the manner of his death would finally be. So he knew that the time for it had not yet come. She told him, too, that she herself would be with him on his last day, on the banks of the Boyne River, when a wild hart would gore and kill him. After she had spoken those 2, the mortal and the fairy smiled gravely at each other, for such was the fair hair's power that she had armored. Teague against fear. She had armored Teague against fear. Although the men with him shuffled anxiously and whispered among themselves, but they followed Teague willingly when he left the court, and with the fairy beside him crossed the flowering plain again and made his way through the enchanted wood to the curragh. The water whispered around the ship's bow as it headed down the estuary. High above the masts the 3 birds rode the bright air and sang without cease. On the bank stood the fairy, arrow straight and star bright. She neither moved nor spoke again, but she watched Teague steadily. When the curragh reached open water and gathered speed, Teague turned to look a last time, and thus saw the sheet of mist that rose from the water at the island shore and crept swiftly up the banks, curling around the trees and around the figure of the fairy, until at last it blanketed even the tops of the tallest oaks. And that concludes part 2. We will continue next time. Thank you guys for tuning in. And we will see you next time. Go out and have a great day.